Right, hello everybody, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. So my name, as you can see, is Jason James, and I'm actually in the office in London for the first time for about 2 months, I think. So it's very nice to have you all here for this book launch. I'm in London, and our main speaker and the author of the book is Dr. Jelena Stojković, and she's also in London. And then we're going to have two people talking about the book with her. So we have Dr. Luke Gartlan, who is in St Andrews in Scotland, and Dr. Tessel Bauduin, who is joining us from Amsterdam. And I'll just very briefly introduce all of those people. So Dr. Jelena Stojković is lecturer in history and theory of photography at the Arts University, Bournemouth, and specializes in art and photography in Japan. And today we're talking primarily about surrealism and photography in the 1930s. She's also been a Japan Foundation Fellow at the University of Tokyo and an Associate Lecturer at the University of the Arts, London. So then the next one is Dr. Luke Gartlan, joining us from St Andrews, where he's Senior Lecturer in the School of Art History. And Luke is a specialist really in Oriental photography, if one's allowed to use the word Oriental, which apparently you were in 2013, because he used it in the title of one of his books. Has covered photography in Japan and China from its inception in the late 19th century. And for 6 years, he was editor of the journal History of Photography. And then our other speaker is Dr. Tessel Bauduin, and joining us from the Open University, the Netherlands, where she is Associate Professor in Modern Art. And Dr. Bauduin is a specialist in Surrealism and has published widely on Surrealism, going all the way back to medieval Surrealism, including Hieronymus Bosch. That's probably all I need to say. But if you want to add anything else about yourselves, by the way, when you come on screen, feel free to do so. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jelena Stojković to talk about her book.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you so much, Jason, for these introductions. I should also thank the Daiwa Foundation for hosting this event, and of course to the wonderful speakers who are joining me in conversation afterwards. Thank you so very much to all of you who are also joining us remotely from your computers. It's so great to see so many familiar faces. I'm glad that we are keeping cameras on. And I look forward to the conversation we're going to have afterwards. I thought that just to start the conversation and to maybe introduce the book to those of you who still haven't had the chance to see it in the bookshops and the libraries because of the obvious reasons, just to kind of give you some sense of how maybe the book is structured, what it actually is about, and how it looks like inside. So I'm going to speak maybe about 10 to 15 minutes, hopefully. And I want to start at the beginning. I want to start from the very title and just kind of draw attention to this first narrative boundary, which is the 1930s. And as a historical, function, it is a very good focus of the book. It helps the, situate material in a certain way, but also immediately it poses a certain kind of a problem. And if we think about Japan in the 1930s, it is a very difficult decade. We had the Manchurian Incident in 1931, the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the Pacific War in 1941. So it's a time when, according to some historians, the war has already started. So 1931, according to some history books, is the beginning of the 15 Years' War in Japan. So how do we even consider a kind of a practice which is openly or should be openly transgressive, radical, and left-oriented, such as surrealism, at that particular time becomes what this book is about. And I'm not claiming to have resolved this issue in any way, but I'm adopting this, let's say, conceptual framework of impossibility to try and unpack it or to talk about it in the book. And I'm explaining how I understand impossibility in the book in so many words. I'm not going to read all of this to you. This is more kind of notes for me, not to forget something, but just to say that whereas on the one hand side, if you were a surrealist openly in the 1930s in Japan, you would risk not only surveillance but prosecution. So that made your work quite tricky. And then that brings to mind the impossibility not only of surrealist practice in Japan, but of avant-garde as such, because how we understand surrealism comes from a very Eurocentric perspective. We think of Europe first and then tend to compare other parts of the world to it. So this is kind of the first premise of that impossibility. However, Japan is complicated in the 1930s because we cannot just put it on the other side of that Orientalist discourse and say that it's, you know, a case study in diversifying it, because Japan was not only subject to Orientalizing gaze of the West, but was also simultaneously occupying and colonizing various countries in Asia in the 1930s. So that makes this situation even more so impossible. And then if we even acknowledge those kinds of things, we have to consider how this practice was essential to the continuation of avant-garde post-war. So even if we try to kind of unpack or diminish its importance from the point of view that I've just listed, we have to acknowledge that it kind of enabled an emergence of a post-war avant-garde practice in Japan after the war, and especially that also it kind of fed into certain kinds of practice that became more prominent after the war, such as women avant-garde photographers. So how I like to think about that word in specific is to consider that it was not only impossible as in that it highlighted a certain kind of limitation of possibilities, but it was also impossible in a surrealist kind of childish way, that it refused to be put down, it refused to be stopped and resisted in different kinds of ways to kind of continue into the 1950s. So the book is structured, the narrative is structured through these three contextual photographic terms: the new photography, the avant-garde photography, and plastic photography. And if a non-Japanese speaker is going to read the book, I'm hoping maybe these three words only is what they're going to learn: the Shinko Shashin, Zene Shashin, and Zoke Shashin, kind of repeating themselves throughout the book. So I find them very useful because they offer the means to chart how surrealist photography emerged in Japan at the beginning of the 1930s through a certain kind of modernist practice, and then managed to flourish and come to fruition as an avant-garde practice, and then had to renegotiate its existence towards the later part of the decade through this framework of plastic photography. So I want to elaborate just a little bit more about these three and to show a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. And what made, let's say, the modernist photography or Shinko Shashin appear and flourish in Japan at the beginning of the 1930s was the photographic part of the film and photo exhibition that came to Japan in 1931. So photographic techniques such as photomontage and photogram, which were considered radical at the time, were what really started to draw attention, and where some of these manifestations of surrealist, more so artistic kinds of ideas started to appear. But it's really important to acknowledge from the very beginning, and as we can see in this line in Nakayama's Zivita cover page for Asahi Camera in May 1932, most of these images and most of the images that I reproduced in the book were intended originally for the print, for the photographic magazines. And even if they weren't, they're really difficult to locate or don't exist anymore in physical prints. So a lot of the research that went into the book was actually research of photographic magazine collections. So when we speak about these kinds of technological kind of experimentations with photography, they not only drew photographers in, but also artists. So it's really important to acknowledge that these people, whom we might call surrealist photographers in Japan in the 1930s, were considering or identifying themselves both as artists and as photographers, and AQ is a very good example of such a practitioner. And it's really important to acknowledge also that most of activity that generated surrealist photographic imagery at the time actually came out of photo clubs. So it was not a surrealist group as such that would frame them, because we said due to the peace preservation law, it wasn't really possible to have a centralized surrealist group as such in Japan at the time, but it was mostly through the so-called amateur photographic activity that some of this imagery came to be. So I made a very conscious decision in the book to also include even completely anonymous amateur photographers such as Matsubara Juzo here, just to show the richness and the kind of extent of this material, because it was photographers and artists across Japan, not only Tokyo, but even more so in Kansai and Osaka and Ashia, but as far as Miyazaki and Fukuoka, who were doing or engaging with this kind of practice. And I feel that this is a really important element of the book. Where we see kind of photography starting to become more acknowledged as a practice in 1930s Japan, and where it gets really direct crossovers with art world at the time, is in the use of photo collage. And it's important to say that it was not only photographers and artists, but also critics and writers who would make these, as in this example of Yamanaka Chiru's Iliao no San Facile from 1937. And it was not only the shared interest in a certain kind of technology or technique, such as photo collage, but also in certain kinds of tropes and motifs, as in this case is this very famous motif of the two-way mirror. So kind of Carol's Alice situation that I'm highlighting. And even kind of in the practices that would be interested in collage and not photography as such only, we start to see from very early on in the decade a very particular kind of collaborative work that emerges from these interests. So I want to just show this example where Nagata Isshu and Abe Yoshifumi are clearly working together to develop this interest in a two-way mirror by kind of appropriating elements of each other's images. So Nagata Isshu there on the left, just taking over this mirror image of a mountain lake in his work from Abe Yoshifumi. It was the 1937 exhibition of foreign surrealist works that really gave this kind of practice credibility, and that it pushed it, so to say, to a different level. And then we get this kind of maturing of surrealist photography in Japan, 1937, 1938, where a number of photographers around clubs across Japan are starting to really experiment mostly with the surrealist object, and to work in this kind of practice that I identified as very directly collaborative. So in Osaka, for instance, here in the work of Hirai Terushichi and Yasui Nakaji, we can see the kind of collective use of the same objects or the same elements, this pole in all of the three images that starts to appear as a kind of shared element, but also in other clubs as well, such as in Nagoya, we get a very similar kind of shared interest in certain kinds of objects, in this case, natural objects, and work starts to emerge in a very direct and very explicit collaborative way. This kind of situation from 1937 to 1938 unfortunately lasted not for too long, but it did generate also a kind of a critical discourse. So it's important to highlight that a lot of artists and photographers themselves wrote about the imagery that they made in their practice in different publications, and the best established surrealist critics such as Takiguchi Shuza and Yamano Kachiro also wrote about surrealist photography extensively. So another element of the book is really engaging with those texts in detail. But towards the end of the decade, 1939 and 1940, what we get is a really heightening of political oppression, and even such words as surrealism and avant-garde become problematic to be heard in public. So we get a lot of this image making transferred, so to say, under the discourse of plasticity, and how it manifests visually is as a very direct kind of citation to surrealist painting. So you get the use of close-up and these ambiguous backgrounds in almost direct mimicry of such famous artists as Salvador Dali, but you also get really explicit experimentation in the darkroom, where there is an intention to kind of merge surrealist practice with abstraction. So people like Sakata Minoru produced these large-scale prints in 1939 as kind of an ambitious claim of this amateur practice, not only kind of exerting itself as important, but as artistically valid. So at that time we get, let's say, a very idiosyncratic, very particular kind of practice maturing, but it also becomes very, very complicated in a way that the representation of everyday life, not only in Japan, but also in the occupied territories in Asia, becomes subject of some of these photographs. So even the most famous surrealist photographers, such as Abe Yoshifumi, sometimes went to the what was referred to as the continent and took imagery of the vernacular local culture. And this kind of interest in 1939 and 1940 also translates to a lot of practice of surrealist photographers in Japan. So this kind of aporia that opens in the impossibility to exercise any kind of political dissent, when it comes so close to the simultaneous claiming of, let's say, locality as very authentic and unique by kind of parallel discourses at the time, is when the situation becomes even more complicated in the decade. In the 1940, it becomes completely impossible to come out with any kind of this practice, and this is where kind of this story of the book comes to an end. I also reframe it, at least partially, in the 1950s, just to show some of the ways through which this practice continues after the war, but this is where I'm going to end my presentation. So I hope that gives at least some idea of the kinds of impossibilities, of this entanglement of impossibilities that the book tries to address, and at least gives a small sample of the imagery that are contained in the book. Of course, there is so much more to it, and hopefully we can address some of those issues as we open up to the conversation. So what I would like to do is to invite the speakers to join me in the conversation, and maybe start first from Luke.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stojković, for your overview of the book and for raising some of the kind of key issues and materials. This is a really fascinating book, full of great material, I have to say. I really enjoyed reading it. And I think for me, I haven't done so much work in the 1930s, but what I found so helpful, therefore, was to get a real overview of the kind of complexity of these worlds, these art worlds. It's not just a book about photographers, it's a book about, firstly, what photographers did, well beyond just taking photographs. That they wrote, that they translated, that they outreached, they networked, and all this despite everything that was going on at a political level within the country. And I think that's an important thing to kind of, for historians of photography to communicate more broadly about the significance of what they work on, that these were not just figures with a camera in camera clubs. They were much more significant beyond necessarily their particular photography world. And therefore, the kind of broader issue here is also about their contribution and tensions with the art world more generally within both Japan and internationally at the time. So a sense of the journals, the editors, the translators, these figures who might not necessarily have their name on the photograph, but who are involved in making these sorts of materials available, I think has been an important turn more generally in photographic studies more recently. And this book makes a really important contribution to it, I think, in 1930s Japan, and understanding that, that kind of richness despite everything that was going on. What else? I also found, as the title sort of suggests, of course, one comes back again and again and again as a reader to this issue of how impossible it was. And I found myself thinking about not just the impossibility as it was presented, but the real ambivalence. A kind of fought dart game, if I can use that sort of term, a kind of the lure of surrealism for these avant-garde figures in Japan. And at the same time, a real kind of sense of anxiety around the political situation and what it meant to take on a kind of surrealist label. So I was particularly fascinated by a discussion between Nakiguchi and Nagata in private correspondence. And there's a great photograph of the two of them in a Japanese bath together. It's really fabulous. Where Nagata says, well, I'm interested in photography. It's really strong, my interest, but I'm not actually a surrealist. And Takiguchi, who clearly is one of the major translators and one of the major figures in reaching out, in the 1950s, he went and sought out Breton and met him, as Dr. Stojković puts it towards the end of the book. Even he says, well, I am and I'm not a surrealist, to paraphrase. So I was interested in the kind of conditions of the reception and how these artists were identifying, in not just in terms of their own practice, but in terms of their identity and their collective identity. So, what I'm sort of suggesting here is I found a very rich book, well worth reading, and the questions are still sort of percolating in my mind as I talk to you now. And that said, I think I also had some questions that I'd like to raise with Dr. Stojković and hopefully get a conversation going after my little blurb there. Let's begin perhaps with one of the questions that struck me was about how photography's role is not just about what's represented, but photography is a mediating technology itself of sorts of knowledges about surrealism coming into Japan. So I want to ask her how you understand photography as sort of mediating the reception of, does it matter that it's photography as opposed to other sorts of technologies? Print.
Thank you so much, Luke, and thank you so much for that wonderful overview. I think it's probably one of the most difficult questions in terms of the very, again, impossibility of existence of surrealist photography as such in certain kinds of discourses, or at least at the time and for a long time afterwards, photography was kind of sidelined in comparison to painting and sculpture, at least, as a medium which could be considered as on par relevant artistic practice. Of course, in terms of literature, the comparison is very difficult. So it took a while to the discourse to start realizing what it can be. And I think from the 70s and 80s, there has been different kinds of understanding of what surrealist photography might be. So, Susan Sontag speaks that all photography is surrealist in a way, because it's precisely such a strong mediating medium that it does incorporate some key surrealist ideas, whereas for other interpreters, surrealist photography is at the core of surrealist action, as it were, because it's such a rich medium and it allows so many different interventions. So I think in Japan, all of this has been not only acknowledged, but really understood and practiced at the time. And what you put forward as ambiguity and as some of these discussions that were held in real time, to me means that there was real self-awareness of one's position, not only in Japan, but also in kind of international circles, in terms of the work that some of these photographers, artists, and critics were doing at the time. So in terms of Takiguchi, for instance, when he speaks to Nagata, it's one kind of language. And it's, of course, published in Japanese press. But when he writes to surrealists outside of Japan, to Roland Penrose, for instance, in 1938, he really clearly expresses the kind of limitations of this practice in terms of political censorship of any kind of progressive or even, explicit material to appear in Japan. So there are records where this kind of, let's say, burden is even more explicitly expressed. But this ways through which in language the practice was negotiated throughout the decade is fascinating, to say the least. And I must say that this book was my PhD thesis, and it emerged from there. And during my PhD, the kind of theorization of this was one of the major elements. And for the book, I decided that maybe it should speak to wider audiences, and that it's not perhaps the most important thing, that the most important thing is to give visibility to some of these photographs. But there is a number of ways through which you could start and theorize this way of negotiating one's practice at the time, precisely as a kind of maybe even a deliberate activity.
Dr. Stojković, can I continue on that with a question regarding politics now that the issue has been raised?
Yes, please.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me, and I think this is a really wonderful and excellent book. And I also really enjoyed the images, as you just noted, because they are so unknown, and it's so important that they get out there and that they get seen. And I think you've written a very important contribution also to the study of global surrealism, and also the study of avant-garde in the world outside of Europe. And I think when we talk about surrealism, in particular surrealism in countries that are not France, the issue of politics, it's already inevitable when it comes to surrealism. But for all that the French surrealists were all in favor of being very revolutionary politically in comparison with groups in other countries, they had it quite easy. And I think your study and also the concept of the impossible avant-garde really shows sort of the difficulties that artists had to deal with the world over, but also in Japan, as you show. And I was fascinated to read that people cannot even use the term surrealism itself. And they can also not use the term revolution, where you sort of get this very surrealist pseudo-Freudian word games that you have to use code all the time to talk about what you're talking about, and the sign and that is signified sometimes relates, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think artists do find ways, as you show as well, to be, even if there's so much censorship, artists find ways to be subversive, to be radical, potentially even revolutionary. The question I want to ask, there are several of them, but let me start. Can you say a bit more about, so how do the language of photography and how do the language of surrealism play a part in the way that the artists in the 1930s interact with the political climate that they're in, first of all?
Absolutely, thank you so much for that. And I think first to maybe go back a little bit and address this understanding, let's say, of Japan's position within the international network of surrealism. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of surrealist scholarship has been really the movement in this direction. And Michael Richardson's International Encyclopedia of International Surrealism that came out last year, and a couple of ongoing projects are really kind of, I think, moving the entire field towards that kind of discussion. So I think they are critically important. And in terms of Japan, at least, if we start making different kinds of connections, not to France only, but let's say to Egypt or to Belgium or to the Caribbean, then we start to get a bit of a different picture. And I wish only that those artists in 1930s Japan maybe also kind of could get a better sense of themselves in those terms, because for instance, in Egypt in the 1930s, there was a similar kind of struggle with the representation of traditional values, whereas the kind of dispersal of the network was very common in Belgium as well as in England. So there are certain things within this network which are not Japan specific, but you know, when you just speak about Japan or any other country, it becomes kind of more isolated in that way. In terms of this connection between, let's say, art and photography and how they mediate surrealism as such in Japan of the time, I find it super important to highlight that photography was not recognized as a artistic practice as such, and that means that it wouldn't be included in major state-sponsored exhibitions, it wouldn't be studied in fine art schools, it wouldn't have a market, and this is what distinguished it from other forms of fine art practice at the time. So it's super important to understand this. And I think in Europe as well, a lot of surrealist photography, if you like, a lot of surrealists did very directly and very openly communicate with this notion of amateur photography. So they would either adopt or appropriate certain kinds of practices, or they would even make certain amateur photographers such as Auger into, you know, major photographic figures. So the fact that these photographers were amateurs and not professionals maybe meant more to themselves at the time, but historically, from a historical kind of distance, they got a kind of freedoms that other types of practice could not have. So if you were a poet or a writer, the fear of persecution was much more real. And if you were a painter, the kinds of restrictions to what you could paint, again, were much more strict, even earlier in the decades. So I was new and exciting, but also that kind of allowed a certain kind of expression to migrate into that domain. And
so there's more freedom.
I believe so, absolutely. That I even think that it fell off the radar of censorship for a long while. All the way through 1937 and 8, you could still produce quite radical imagery as long as you would not openly write or express it as such. And even in certain cases, as late as in 1940, if you only kind of put a public proclamation of certain kinds of supports, then you could still do what you pretty much wanted to do in a certain kind of way, content-wise. So there was a huge disparity, as Dr. Gartlan noticed, between the language and the image, but also there was a huge disparity between different kinds of practices. So thank you, both of you, for noticing that immediately.
Just one quick follow-up question before I give it back to Luc. So if surrealism is a site of resistance, then, as you're saying, photography is a perfect medium for that. But I was also wondering, one of the things you see in a global context of avant-garde artists under pressure, that surrealism is also a safe space. That it's perhaps because it's also associated with an inner space. And if there's if there are so many difficult circumstances, very often with these smaller groups of artists, you see that surrealism offers something. And in this case, I wanted to ask you, what do you think that surrealism offers that people weren't able to get perhaps in other forms of avant-garde art?
Sure. I mean, I would be very careful to label it as a form of resistance. As I said, in 1930s, I'm afraid that such a thing simply would not be possible.
No.
If such kind of very open resistance to something would have been articulated, I don't think it could have been articulated in a way. So I think there's still a much longer and much more eloquent discussion about that, I'm sure, among historians taking place. But in terms of art historians such as myself, there is something about what Luc also recognized as a kind of coding of language that also, I believe, takes place in imagery. So the, let's say, meaning gets translated from language into a certain kind of imagery. But to answer your question a bit more to the point, what I think people got from engaging with surrealism at the time and in such circumstances is pretty much what surrealism, at least in theory, offers. And this is this kind of a liberation of the mind. So people tend to think about surrealism as a politically active movement and kind of forget that even in the French group, you know, after the Aragon Affair of 1929, there was no such thing as political activism as such, because the French group decided to take a different route from the Communist Party, and they've decided that their kind of action as such should take place in a different domain, in the domain of the mind, in the domain of the intellectual thinking, etc. So how I see this is important is that through the exercise of certain kind of image making, or certain kind of thinking, which I think it reflects, it did enable a continuation of certain kind of practice. And I don't see that this kind of practice is necessarily just adopted from abroad, but that it kind of, this is what enabled a certain kind of way of thinking, maybe also connected to resistance, if this is the word that we want to use, that kind of then gets a bigger platform, a bigger kind of historical moment to express itself in the 60s. Right?
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you for that really interesting response. I mean, I think it feeds into one question I had more broadly, which is also about the question of audience for this work, and whether there's a kind of part of the kind of way in which the potential of photography, shall we say, of surrealism is being circumscribed is in terms of what sort of audience this work is being directed towards. So as long as it stayed within particular circles, that was okay. But perhaps one of the dangers of the amateur aspect of photography was just how dispersed photography is through 1930s Japan as a kind of everyday practice which individuals are doing. And I wonder whether that sort of the conditions around particular media, also conditions around, there were conditions around particular audiences as well, both domestic within Japan, not only within Japan, but also perhaps making separations between the urban. I mean, one of the things I found really great to see in the book was the interest in some of the photography around ideas of nature. I think it's quite easy to look at Japanese photography, Japanese surrealism, and think of it as an urban practice. So I thought it was quite important to look at some of those sort of landscape sorts of practices as well. And whether, when we're talking about the codings, therefore, there are different codings, different levels of codings going on, of potential resistance, shall we say. One for the international, because of course one form of resistance, or at least one form of escape, might be exile. So there's a question of why perhaps some of these artists didn't just leave if they felt the circumstances, if they're reaching out to figures like Penrose as a form of leaving, you know, trying to create an international surrealism themselves. Or they go back home, they go back to Miyazaki, they leave, you know, as another form. So I was struck by perhaps the different strategies that are going on, both at a personal and in terms of the work that's being produced, and how you see that fitting into the broader project of 1930s practice in Japan.
I think there's so many, this is now getting complex complex to follow. I think, again, to kind of highlight that I'm not a historian as such, but to my understanding, this is one of the main differences between Japan and maybe other countries in the Axis in the 1930s, that there was no possibility of exile. So if you were to exile, you would, at least in the United States, be put in camps, and in Europe you would be kind of deported back to Japan. So it wasn't really a personal choice in that sense. And the question of negotiation was the question of survival more so than the question of choice. So that, I think, makes, again, this material such an interesting and resonant case study even today, in a sense that, you know, how do you come to terms with certain conditions that maybe you haven't chosen for yourself? And as you said, this is super individual, how different people reacted to this. I think the case of AQ that you bring forward, the kind of, let's say, inner exile, so just trying to kind of disconnect and disengage from public discourse, was how a lot of intellectuals reacted in the 1930s. And it is very maybe important to remember that at that time, although as some historians kind of in hindsight can trace a really clear lineage of how things progressed from 1931 to 1941, that wasn't by no means clear to the people living at the time in real time. So I'm not the kind of historian who sees those circumstances as given. So at any of those points in 1931, in 1937, in 1939, even in 1940, I'm sure there were people who thought there was something they could do to kind of act, at least their own, let's say, ways of thinking or feeling about certain things, even if it doesn't amount to anything beyond that. So I think that kind of field of personal field of resistance, the kind of micro scale of that political resistance, is very important to acknowledge. This is where it kind of ends, but it does, I think, should at least resonate later on. So in terms of kinds of imagery that this produces, and the investments in different kinds of styles, if you like, such as landscape or objects or portraits, etc., I think Japan, again, it was so versatile that it really was a huge struggle to cut down the number of images. I think the material is so rich, there is so much more, as a matter of fact, of this, that it was more kind of a balance between, let's say, some of the imagery that was well known before, and some of the kind of never before seen types of material that I wanted to combine. But absolutely, there are so many different ways through which people kind of express themselves in these circumstances within the given milieu.
So I had to take one more question, if I could.
Absolutely.
A question we raised earlier, I think you can see it coming, Dr. Stojković, which is around the question of gender, you know, and the significance of women surrealists overseas is well known. So if we're talking about like the impossible avant-garde, it seemed to be particularly impossible for women surrealists in Japan. So I wondered, you know, therefore was quite strong obstacles, seemingly, that I'd like to ask you to kind of explain to us what was adding to it. And because of those obstacles, whether or not that meant that the surrealism that came into Japan was somewhat circumscribed, that the contribution of women surrealists in Europe and America was minimized, shall we say.
So a very important question, and thank you so much for raising it. It was one of the, I believe, largest struggles I had with the material, that I almost had moments of giving it up, because it is 100% male photographers that I discussed in the 1930s, and then the connections, or, you know, female photographers starting to emerge in the 1950s. But I think there are at least a couple of things that I want to highlight there. For one, the wider network of surrealist artists, by was by no means male only, and it is photography only, and to my knowledge only, that this is predominantly a male practice. I think there is something about photography and the commitment to the medium at that particular time that made it less accessible to women artists. And I don't want to also suggest there were no women photographers in the 1920s, 1930s, because we know that there were, and luckily they are getting the attention that they deserve. The Tokyo Photographic Art Museum has put together a wonderful show of Yamazawa Eiko last year, and she is certainly a very good example of somebody who since the 1930s had an active studio in Osaka, studied abroad, was really active in the post-war kind of circles as well. So it's not that there was no women surrealists, it wasn't that there was no women photographers, it was just the fact that maybe there was no women surrealist photographers. And maybe is a big maybe, because this is just one kind of book, and hopefully somebody can pick up on it and locate maybe other ways of thinking of women's presence in this practice. I try to do this with one particular presence, and it's somebody called Misaki Yoko, who appears in a number of photographs in Osaka in the 1930s. So this is to reach out to anybody who has any information about this figure, to maybe start kind of looking more actively, because I simply wasn't able to do so yet. And it feels to me that even in terms of women surrealist photographers, in the kinds of international circles that we now take for granted, took a long time to be recognized. So Takiguchi Shizu writes about Dorama in 1940 in the Photo Times. There is a whole issue dedicated of that magazine to women photographers in 1940. They all pride themselves of the knowledge of surrealist women photographers, and there seems to indicate that they would equally support them, but there is a number of difficulties, and I don't want to minimize the kind of obstacles that they would have had to come through to become recognized as such. So maybe there is also a change in perception of what we mean as a woman photographer in Japan. Is it somebody who was an active participant in this kind of practice that we might also think of as a presence is something that at least I try to do. But absolutely, this is hopefully, a growing field of research, and I would really look forward to see more developments.
But I think for today, I'll draw it to a close. I know you had loads more questions, Tessel in particular, but we're going to have to call a halt today. So thank you very much indeed to all three of you.